And now you have the most powerful nation in the world being influenced by the descendants of those who say we have no king but Caesar. And now to say Christ is king is being put forth as some sort of anti-Semitic thing that's going to be used to beat Christians over the head with. And I think this could have been avoided if they had have listened to the men like Archbishop Lefebvre, who talked about the kingship of Christ as being paramount and warning of the uncrowning of our Lord as being the detriment of the church and society. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. So we're in Lent. Easter is around the corner, sort of. Depends how strict your Lenten fast is. Might go slower or faster. And whenever we're approaching a major Christian feast, usually Easter or Christmas, you see something in the public square. You see basically an attack on Christians. You'll notice this at the grocery stores, and the magazines will have, things like, did Jesus really exist? Or you'll have something, a documentary series or special released on the History Channel or National Geographic or something talking about we found the bones of Jesus or whatever. Something going after the Christian faith. Well, something extra spicy has happened that is at the heart of the Christian faith. And the fact that it's happening in 2025 is quite striking. And we're going to discuss that. Stay tuned. Now, we are going to be discussing some aspects relating to the Kingship of Christ, Fatima, and the Sacred Heart devotion, along with parts of the Jewish question. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go. But speaking thereof, I am going to the Holy Land this fall. And if you would like to come on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to visit the sacred sites where our Lord walked, the apostles, the Virgin Mary, and so forth, you can check the link underneath, the link in the description area for the Holy Land trip. You can also go to kennedyhall.ca/holy-land, kennedyhall.ca/holy-land. We just had a great pilgrimage last year in Italy. It was a smashing success, and it was a really wonderful time with all those who came. And if you'd like to be part of something amazing, check the link in the description area of the podcast. Okay, so a little background. Well, recently a report has been released, and I'll show you what this report is on the screen here. So a place called the Network Contagion Research Institute released a report called Thy Name in Vain, How Online Extremists Hijacked Christ is King. And it's basically, the crux of it is essentially that online Christians are using the term Christ is King as hate speech, more importantly or more acutely anti-Semitic speech. And you can see the authors, and a lot of them obviously have Jewish names. One of them is Jordan Peterson. And what's amazing about this is it's called Thy Name in Vain. And it's hard to find a commentator out there who uses the Lord's name in vain more often than Jordan Peterson does. Now, this same place released a video talking about this whole phenomenon, in their opinion, of anti-Semitism by those who say Christ is King. I'm not really sure what the copyright rules are, and I'm afraid if I play the video that I'll get some sort of copyright thing. You never know. But you can check that out. Michael Matt, actually at The Remnant, did a really good video sort of breaking this down as part of one of his news reports. If you check one of his most recent videos, it's somewhere around the 30-minute mark where he discusses it. In any event, the crux of the matter is, from this report, is that if you go around yelling Christ is King, you might be part of some anti-Semitic conspiracy that is used to subjugate Jews and blah, 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 blah. Well, my friends, there are no accidents in history. We might call them coincidences. We might call them providence. Maybe you might follow Mark Twain and say history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Well, there is something curious going on right now. And we got to do a deep dive back into history to explain what I'm talking about. Many of you may not know, but I am an author, and I've authored numerous best-selling books. And if you go to kennedyhall.ca/books, that's kennedyhall.ca/books, you can find my catalog of books available through Amazon. And the link for that is in the description area. So back in the 1600s, our Lord revealed the Sacred Heart devotion to Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque. This is a perennial Catholic devotion, and this was revealed to this young French woman. And of course, you've likely heard of the devotion to the Sacred Heart. You've probably seen images of the Sacred Heart. But just a little background about Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque. She was born in Burgundy, France, and from childhood felt called by Jesus, vowing chastity, despite not fully understanding it. After her father's death, she faced hardships, including illness that left her immobile for years until she dedicated herself to the Virgin Mary and was miraculously cured. This deepened her devotion, and she took the name Mary at confirmation. Her family was quite poor, and they experienced depression from relatives after her father's death. And this helped her empathize with Jesus' suffering, and he frequently appeared to her. And she united her trials to his. Despite her mother's pleas to Mary, Margaret Mary's encounters with Christ, once appearing scourged after a dance, reinforced her resolve to enter religious life. She joined the Visitation Convent at Paray-le-Monial in 1571, or 1671, I believe, where Jesus confirmed her calling. As a nun, she experienced visions of his Sacred Heart, revealing his desire for its veneration. And in 1689, this is the money part here, Jesus requested Frances' consecration to his Sacred Heart, a message she conveyed, but sadly without success. Eventually, the devotion was officially approved in the church, and she was canonized in 1920. But think about this, okay? So in 1689, Christ requested the consecration of France to his Sacred Heart. Now, what happened 100 years after 1689 in France? If you know any of your French history, you'll know that something terrible happened. And this was the French Revolution. And literally 100 years after, France experienced basically a dissolving of the government, and then a massive genocide actually happened against Catholics. The king was commanded by this revelation of Christ to Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart, but it never happened. And now, whether or not the kings were knew that there was a diabolical plot by the enemies of Christ, largely the Freemasons, to rid the country of their monarch and the precious Catholic faith, God only knows. But there was something going on during that time. The Enlightenment was beginning, and very anti-Catholic forces were gaining steam. And this is the era called the French Enlightenment. You might think of writers such as Voltaire, who wrote, every sensible man, every honorable man must hold the Christian religion in horror. Or Denis Diderot, who lived from 1713 to 1784, who wrote, man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Pretty graphic stuff. And this was happening just around the exact same time when the kings of France were supposed to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart, but they didn't. And the cost of ignoring this request was extremely dramatic. And we know of the extreme social upheaval that happened in France, which was the French Revolution. This reshaped the world, and it reshaped France, and Europe especially. The monarchy was toppled, and the nobility was divested of their hereditary power, and the Catholic Church was subordinated to the French government. 100 years after our Lord's request, the reigning king of France, Louis XVI, was stripped of his power, and 4 years later he was publicly executed by the guillotine. The ideas of the French Revolution were liberty, equality, and brotherhood. terminology, which is at the heart of the nation of the United States as well. And these were combined with a program of de-Christianization. Now, here's what's fascinating about this. Our Lord reveals the Sacred Heart devotion. Nothing happens. Obviously, it takes off in the hearts of Catholics, but particularly in this country, our Lord reveals this devotion. And there is a command by Christ, and we'll talk about that in a sec. We'll show where Christ said he commanded it, that the country should be consecrated to the Sacred Heart. But they don't. And as we've said, we have the French Revolution. And what results from this is a genocide. All French Catholic property was seized. Within the first 4 days of the revolution, 1,300 assassinations took place in Paris. The Blessed Sacrament was desecrated. Churches and their contents were destroyed. Priests and bishops who refused to take the oath of the new government, of the liberalism, were brutally massacred. Priests and nuns were tied together and drowned. Lots of executions of groups of nuns and so on and so forth. And those living in the region in the western part of France, known as the Vendée, you've probably heard of the heroes of the Vendée, refused to join the revolutionaries, and they remained loyal to both the king and the church. And the revolutionary government of the First Republic sent 45,000 troops to face the Catholic and royal army of the Vendée. After the initial victories of the people of the Vendée, the same committee responsible for the Reign of Terror ordered the destruction of the Vendée and its inhabitants. This is actually looked at as probably the first European genocide. The Republican Army destroyed crops and farms, razed towns and villages, ransacked churches, burned down forest. It was literally a scorched earth policy, and they murdered basically everyone. This was a genocide with scope and scale based on populations that was on par with any genocide that happened in the 20th century, just to put it in perspective. Now, here's the thing. This all could have been avoided. And it was not just physical evils that happened. The revolutionary government outlawed Christianity. They outlawed everything. But it could have been avoided. In 1931, if we fast forward, our Lord appeared to Sister Lucy. You might remember Sister Lucy. She was the nun who, one of the seers of Fatima, who told the Holy See that the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary was required or requested by heaven. And our Lord said to Sister Lucy in 1931 in Rianjo, Spain, "Make it known to my ministers, given that they follow the example of the King of France in delaying the execution of my command, they, like him, will follow him into misfortune." And obviously he was referring to his command, his desire that the Sacred Heart devotion be spread, officialized, and that the nation of France consecrate France to the Sacred Heart, which never ended up happening. So our Lord is saying, hold on, if you don't do this, something bad is going to happen. Now, the purpose of this episode is not to talk all about the Fatima question, because there is debate on that. The Fatima apparitions took place in 1917. The request specifically for how the Sacred Heart, or the Immaculate Heart consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart was expressed in 1929. There has been debate about whether or not you have to just say Russia or whether you could say other nations as well, because our Lord did request that other nations be consecrated to the Immaculate and Sacred Heart in some of the apparitions to Sister Lucy. And does that mean that the 100 years will be up in 1929? Did our Lord mean that something would happen 100 years later after 1929? I don't know, because he appears in 1931 saying, hey, it's getting late, which is obviously far from 100 years after the Fatima consecrations were requested. So what was the result? Well, I mean, was it the fact that the Second World War took place and that was the result of not consecrating Russia to the Immaculate Heart? Was it the Second Vatican Council, the reforms of Vatican II, all this sort of spiritual chastisement that has befallen us? I don't know. But there is something I do know that's kind of curious. We're in 2025 right now, and we have this, basically, this explosion of, there's this growing tension happening in the public square amongst people who would call themselves conservatives. And usually conservatives are pretty simpatico when it comes to Christianity. So there is not really a lot of public tension between those with a strong allegiance to Israel and Jewish supremacy ultimately, and those who don't. And it's kind of reached a boiling point as of late. A lot more commentators are getting more bold about it. It's a lot of big names are talking about it. You know, a lot of major conservative influencers are coming out against, the policies of the state of Israel. They're starting to ask questions you're not really supposed to ask. We're seeing lines drawn. Of course, the Daily Wire crowd and things like that are, they're basically accepting everyone to follow the Noahide laws, if you know what that means. You're seeing a lot of things kind of get interesting right now. And Jordan Peterson, arguably one of the world's most famous conservative intellectuals, whatever that means to be a conservative intellectual, he's now basically co-authoring reports saying that Christ is King has been co-opted. Well, here's the thing. Again, we're in 2025. What happened 100 years ago? We are in the 100th anniversary, the year of the 100th anniversary of a very important document written by Pope Pius XI called Quas Primas. Quas Primas is the document that Pius XI wrote instituting the feast of the Kingship of Christ. And he instituted this feast, and you can go read the document. I won't read the whole thing here. I actually narrated the document, so I'll put the link for that underneath if you want to listen to the document rather than reading. I narrated it. You can listen to it for free. He instituted the Feast of Christ the King to establish peace in the world. And I'll read you a couple quotes from it here to show what he was expressing. And near the beginning of the document, he says, talking about the Kingship of Christ extending to all creation, he says, the foundation of this power lies in the fact that Christ has dominion over all creatures, a dominion not seized by violence nor usurped, but by his essence and nature. But his by essence and nature. His kingdom is founded upon the ineffable hypostatic union. From this it follows that not only that Christ is to be adored by angels and men, but that to him as men, angels and men are subject and must recognize his empire. And it's not only of Christians. He says his empire includes not only Catholic nations, not only baptized persons who, though of right belonging to the church, have been led astray by error or have been cut off from her by schisms, talking about Protestants and Orthodox, but also all those who are outside the Christian faith, so that truly the whole of mankind is subject to the power of Christ. Christ is king over the whole world, over all creation, over all people. And this is not merely a kingship of the heart. He is the King of Hearts, but it's not merely a kingship of the heart. Pius X talks about how in the document civil servants are required to profess their allegiance to the law of Christ and so on and so forth, that there can be no censorship or restriction of the spread of the true faith that is Christ in society, meaning the Catholic Church. Anyway, the document goes on and on about Christ is King, and he institutes the feast to be celebrated at the end of October. And he institutes it in 1925. And he says that this feast will be a yearly reminder. And he wants processions and all these sorts of things going on. And it's near the end of the liturgical year, but it's not quite at the end. He wants it just before the celebration of the Holy Souls Triduum. So, All Hallows Eve and All Souls Day and All Saints Day and All Souls Day, because Christ is the King of souls. We belong to him. That's very important to remember. There's a harmony with why the feast is put there. And he says that if men go out in the streets proclaiming the kingship of Christ, that true peace will reign in the world, because there can be no peace aside from the peace of Christ. Now, unfortunately, the Feast of Christ the King was moved with the new calendar, and it was moved to the end of the liturgical calendar, explicitly at the end. So in the new calendar, it's at the end. And what was the symbolism of this? We are moving Christ's kingship to the end. Why? Well, the reasoning from the new Mass proponents is something like, well, Christ is king when he comes at his second coming. He's the Alpha and the Omega, so we put him sort of at the end of the calendar to show how it all is about Christ. I get that, but that also means that really we can ignore his kingship until he comes back. That's kind of the message you get. Whereas Pius XI, sorry, so many popes on the brain, is saying that no, we put him right there before the Holy Souls because Christ is the King of all souls. He's the King of all saints. The whole of creation belongs to him, and this must be recognized. Well, with the old Mass, or with the new Mass, out goes the old Mass, out goes the old calendar, and in comes basically a degradation or a denigration of the place of the kingship of Christ in the church's calendar. When everybody's thinking about Advent and Christmas coming, they just kind of throw the kingship of Christ in there. Just a brief interruption here, ladies and gentlemen. If you would like to support this podcast, you can go to meretradition.substack.com. You can see that on the screen there. That is where I post a lot of content that is behind a paywall. There's a lot of it, actually. And I do Q&As and so forth for subscribers where you have direct access to me so we can talk about whatever you would like. It helps me to keep the lights on. It helps me to continue doing this show. And if I'm being honest, I never want to be the kind of person who's chasing clickbait and all those kinds of things. And I made that decision to not always go after current events with zeal and whatever. And because of that, I quite frankly will sacrifice a lot of views, and that's fine. I'd rather be able to do this for something that is more meaningful, which is why I want to talk about the depths and the most important things of Catholic tradition, which I do at my Substack, Mere Tradition. And you can find that by clicking the link underneath if you would like to support the show. All right, back to the show. The kingship of Christ was basically ousted from the conscience, from the consciousness, let's say, of Catholics, and the doctrines of the kingship of Christ were forgotten. Archbishop Lefebvre wrote his seminal work, which is his magnum opus called They've Uncrowned Him, talking about how all of the Antichrist doctrines of religious liberty and all these kinds of things were pushed through the Second Vatican Council and the spirit thereof. And the new Mass, it's a very ecumenical endeavor, consulting with the other Protestants and that sort of thing, and with using the Talmudic prayers from the Jewish writings in the offertories and whatnot. And we have, an ecumenical religion presented to the faithful, and the kingship of Christ is basically forgotten. It's an afterthought, a spiritual thing at the end of time kind of thing, as opposed to what Pius XI told us to do with the kingship of Christ. And we need to take it into account the fact that 100 years later, kind of like when our Lord says, hey, they got in trouble in France when they didn't consecrate that country to the Sacred Heart, and 100 years later, disaster falls. We're now 100 years out from the Feast of Christ the King, and the leaders of the church have basically, cast the kingship of Christ aside. To talk about Archbishop Lefebvre for a second, a lot of people think, he got in trouble because he stuck to the old Mass. Well, that was part of it, but he stuck to the old Mass because he stuck to the kingship of Christ. That was his mission in life, was the kingship of Christ. He proclaimed that everywhere. And his greatest horror was that with the council and through it and after, there was this degradation or lowering of the supremacy of the rights of Christ in society. And that was something that was horrifying to him, as it should have been. Now, I'm not saying that our Lord is going to appear and say, because you haven't, continued with the true kingship of Christ in the church, that, it's going to be just like 100 years after the French, just like 100 years after the request for the consecration of France to the Sacred Heart, there's going to be some major calamity. I'm not saying anything like that. I don't have any insight to that. I'm just saying the historical parallels are very striking. And here's the thing, my friends. The fact that this is being pushed largely by conservative Jews, let's just say it as it is, it has to make us think. Because what does the Sanhedrin, what did the Pharisees say in the gospel? We have no king but Caesar. They do not want the kingship of Christ. They just don't. And now we have a leader in America. Sorry to just harp on Trump for a second here, but he's going to bring world peace. He looks like he's ending the war in Ukraine, which is good, obviously. And he's been talking about taking over Palestine and making it into some beautiful, peaceful region. And he's walking lockstep with the leaders of Israel, who are the spiritual inheritance or spiritual heritage of the Pharisees. That's a fact. And that's rabbinical Judaism, is Phariseeism, basically. And they're going to make peace in the Middle East, but without Christ. And now you have huge power brokers in American conservatism pushing this Christ is King as hate speech, anti-Semitism narrative. What's really unfortunate about all this is that there is this massive tension growing, and there are, sadly, a lot of people who do fall into, like, let's say, extremes, and they're going to take this and run with it, and it's not going to be pretty. And I don't advocate for any of that. That's really a sad thing. But it just goes to show that there will be no peace of Christ without the kingship of Christ. There will be no true peace without the peace of Christ. There will be no kingship of Christ without the peace of Christ, and be no peace of Christ without the kingship of Christ. You can't separate those things. And the fact that Conservative Inc. is pushing the idea that saying Christ is king is hate speech or anti-Semitic, while we're 100 years out from that feast, I have this feeling, it's just a feeling, don't take this as, something you need to listen to and actually think I know something. I don't. But I just look at these historical parallels and I say, the consecration of France was not done and they lost France. The consecration of Russia wasn't done. Maybe it was done by Pope Francis. Of course, I've made that argument. Others could make that, but it wasn't done for a really long time, if it was done at all. And the damage is what it is, the errors of Russia spreading and so forth. And they have, in the church, denigrated and sort of lowered and downgraded the kingship of Christ and basically got rid of that doctrine as far as whatever is taught. It's all ecumenism, it's all liberty and blah, blah, blah. And now you have the most powerful nation in the world being influenced by the descendants of those who say we have no king but Caesar. And now to say Christ is king is being put forth as some sort of anti-Semitic thing that's going to be used to beat Christians over the head with. And I think this could have been avoided if they had have listened to the men like Archbishop Lefebvre, who talked about the kingship of Christ as being paramount and warning of the uncrowning of our Lord as being the detriment of the church and society. That's my thoughts. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as always, let me know what you think. This has been Mere Tradition. And until next time, God bless you all. Bye-bye.